I turned 18 surrounded by laughter, music, and raised glasses, right there in the cabin my grandparents had left me. Everyone thought the night was about cake, candles, and my future finally beginning. In a way, they were right, just not in the way they imagined. While people joked on the porch and my parents talked loudly near the fireplace, I slipped away into the quiet back room with my phone in my hand. My heart was pounding harder than it ever had before. One tap. One confirmation. That was all it took. With that single digital signature, the cabin, the land, and everything my grandparents had built over their lifetime were locked into an irrevocable trust. I became the sole trustee. No loopholes. No undo button. My name is Elena Whitmore, and that moment quietly changed everything. I had been planning it for weeks with the attorney my grandparents trusted, counting down the days until I was legally allowed to sign. Outwardly, I said nothing. I smiled, hugged relatives, accepted congratulations. Inside, doubt and resolve wrestled constantly. I wanted to believe my family would respect my grandparents' wishes. But experience had already taught me otherwise. The very next morning, fog still clung to the mountain valleys when I heard gravel crunching outside. A moving truck rolled up the long drive, followed by my parents' car and my younger brother stepping out like it was any other weekend visit. My dad walked toward me confidently, papers tucked under his arm, smiling like he had good news. He didn't even say hello first. He said, "We've taken care of everything. The place is ours now." They started directing the movers immediately, telling them what furniture to load and where boxes should go. I stood there frozen, listening as they talked about timelines and storage units, like I was just another obstacle to manage. Then they noticed the man standing quietly on the porch, dressed neatly, next to a sheriff's deputy holding an official folder. Everything stopped in an instant. Conversations died mid-sentence. Smiles vanished. And I knew, without a doubt, that trusting my instincts had saved me. That confidence didn't come from nowhere. It was built years earlier, when I was 14, the day a thin envelope arrived in the mail that changed how I saw my place in my family. Inside was a full scholarship offer to a prestigious high school in Knoxville, awarded for academic performance. Tuition covered. Recognition earned. I remember running home with it clutched tight against my chest, excitement buzzing through me like electricity. This was proof that my effort mattered. I showed it to my parents the moment I walked in. My mom glanced at it briefly and said, "That's nice," before returning to her phone call. My dad nodded, distracted, eyes fixed on the television where highlights from my brother Caleb's latest football game replayed. Within minutes, the conversation had shifted completely. Caleb had gotten into trouble at school that week, a fight during recess that ended with a suspension. Instead of consequences, the entire household revolved around him. Meetings with the principal, arguments about fairness, a private tutor arranged instantly, even a small get-together with his teammates to cheer him up. My scholarship letter sat untouched on the counter. No celebration. No dinner. No acknowledgement beyond that single "that's nice." I ended up framing the letter myself and hanging it in my room, where it stayed as a quiet reminder that my accomplishments were expected, not celebrated. That was the moment something inside me hardened. I realized that my wins blended into the background, while my brother's mistakes became emergencies. The pattern repeated the following year. Caleb crashed his expensive bike into a neighbor's parked car while showing off. Scratched paint, dented metal, nothing catastrophic but costly enough. I expected consequences. When I had accidentally broken a cherished family vase years earlier, I'd been grounded for weeks. But for Caleb, my parents rushed to apologize, wrote a check to cover repairs, and then took him to upgrade his bike to an even better model. They framed it as a learning experience. I saw it for what it was, reward disguised as responsibility. Those moments shaped me quietly. I stopped sharing good news. I learned to handle disappointment alone. I became self-sufficient not by choice, but necessity. I wasn't angry at Caleb. He was just a kid benefiting from a system built around him. But I learned early that fairness wasn't something I could expect at home. If I wanted security, recognition, or stability, I'd have to create it myself. The cabin in the Smoky Mountains became my refuge. Every trip there felt like entering a different life. The noise faded, replaced by wind in the trees and the steady rhythm of work alongside my grandfather. He taught me how to fix things properly, not rushed, not sloppy. We repaired porch boards together, split firewood, stacked it carefully under the overhang. He never lectured. He showed me. When something held firm, he nodded once, and that approval meant more to me than any praise I'd ever received elsewhere. Evenings belonged to my grandmother. Her kitchen smelled of warmth and patience. Stews simmered slowly, stories unfolded naturally. She listened in a way that made space for everything I never said at home. As they aged, I became more present, helping with appointments, chores, and quiet companionship. They never demanded it. They simply appreciated it. And I felt seen. One night by the fireplace, my grandfather said something that stayed with me. He spoke calmly about finances, about how some people chased money without understanding responsibility. Then he told me plainly that everything they had built would be mine. Not because others didn't want it, but because they wouldn't protect it. Not everyone is meant to hold certain things, he said. That wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. When they passed, the weight of that trust settled fully on my shoulders. And as word spread about rising property values and development in the area, my family's interest shifted rapidly. Visits increased. Conversations turned transactional. The cabin stopped being a memory and became a number. That was when doubt turned into certainty, and certainty turned into action. Turning 18 wasn't about adulthood for me. It was about choosing to protect what mattered, even if it meant standing alone. And that choice had already set everything else in motion. Once the will was read and everything became official, the cabin didn't feel lighter the way people say inheritance does. It felt heavier. Like the air itself carried responsibility. Standing outside afterward, the mountains wrapped in mist, I understood that what my grandparents left me wasn't just property. It was trust, deliberate and specific. And I knew instinctively that trust would be tested. It didn't take long. News about development in the Smoky Mountains spread fast. Articles popped up online talking about expanded tourism, new access roads, luxury cabins going up near Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge. Property values climbed steadily, and suddenly the land my grandparents had bought quietly decades ago became prime. That word started appearing a lot. Prime location. Prime investment. Prime opportunity. My family picked up on it immediately. They began showing up more often, usually without warning. At first, they framed it as concern. Checking in. Making sure I wasn't overwhelmed. My father would comment on maintenance costs, casually adding up repairs out loud. My mother would mention how much easier life could be with a financial cushion. Caleb talked about how selling even part of the land could help him later with college or a better truck. Victor, my uncle, was the most direct. His construction business had collapsed under debt, and desperation clung to him like a shadow. He walked the property lines with a measuring tape, muttering about acreage and views. He brought printouts of recent land sales, highlighting numbers that made my stomach tighten. This market won't last forever, he warned. You don't want to miss the peak. He talked about splitting proceeds fairly, about helping the family. It was always framed as practical, never greedy. But not once did anyone ask what I wanted. The conversations changed tone over time. They stopped pretending this was about preserving anything. It became about timing the sale, about maximizing profit. My grandparents' names disappeared from the discussion entirely. Their wishes were replaced by projections and percentages. Care turned into calculation right in front of me. One weekend, they all came together to walk the boundaries. Victor paced, my father calculated, my mother worried aloud about waiting too long, and Caleb already spent imaginary money in his head. I walked behind them, listening, invisible as always. That day, something inside me clicked fully into place. They didn't see me as the owner or steward. They saw me as an obstacle between them and money. That realization followed me back to Knoxville, riding heavy through every curve of the mountain road. I had already scheduled an appointment with my grandparents' attorney, Jonathan Rice, but the closer the day came, the more my chest tightened. Taking legal action against your own family isn't something anyone prepares you for emotionally. Jonathan's office was quiet, tucked away from the noise of downtown. He greeted me kindly, not rushing, not assuming. We went through everything carefully. The trust documents. The deed transfers. The protections. He explained it all again, patiently, even though I already understood. The trust would remove the property and accounts from my personal estate. No one could claim them. No pressure, no manipulation, no surprise transfers. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Are you prepared for the fallout? It hit harder than I expected. I thought about Christmas mornings when Caleb was little. Family road trips. My mom staying up late to help with a school project once. My dad clapping loudly at a recital I barely remembered. Those moments weren't lies. They existed. And walking away from people you still love, even when they've failed you, feels like tearing something out of yourself. Jonathan didn't push. He waited. He reminded me this wasn't impulsive. That I had thought it through. That my grandparents had thought it through. But permanence has weight. Once signed, there would be no pretending later. No soft reversal if things got uncomfortable. Driving back to the cabin that evening, fog rolled in early. I pulled over at an overlook and shut off the engine. Silence wrapped around me. I imagined holidays without phone calls. Empty tables. Being talked about instead of talked to. The loneliness scared me more than confrontation ever could. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I walked through the cabin touching familiar objects. My grandmother's quilt folded over the couch. My grandfather's carved walking stick leaning by the door. Their presence felt close, grounding. They hadn't chosen me lightly. They'd watched. They'd known. By morning, clarity arrived quietly. Not dramatic. Just steady. Waiting wouldn't make my family respect boundaries. It would only give them time to cross them. Protecting what my grandparents built mattered more than preserving appearances. I went back to Jonathan's office the next day. My hands shook less than I expected. I signed everything. Relief washed over me immediately, followed by grief sharp enough to sting. Courage doesn't erase pain. It just makes room for it. Leaving Knoxville, driving back into the foothills, I felt older than 18 in a way that had nothing to do with years. The invitation came a few days later. A family dinner at the cabin. They framed it as convenience, as togetherness. I agreed. Not because I trusted them, but because I needed to see how far their assumptions had gone. I prepared carefully. Stocked the kitchen. Set the old oak table my grandparents built. Lit the fire early. The evening began pleasantly enough. Weather. Sports. Small talk. Laughter even. For a moment, it almost felt normal. After dessert, I floated. A hypothetical question casually. What if the cabin didn't belong to any of us anymore? What if it went somewhere else entirely? The silence that followed told me everything. They didn't argue sentiment. They didn't ask why. They pivoted instantly to solutions. Selling quickly. Splitting proceeds. Investing smarter. Renovations. Rental income. Turning it into something profitable. Plans stacked on top of plans, detailed and confident, as if decisions were already made. No one asked my opinion. They spoke like owners. Like beneficiaries. Like my role was already decided. I sat there, listening, nodding, refilling cups, while confirmation settled deep in my bones. This wasn't concern. This was entitlement. The trust hadn't just been smart. It had been necessary. Later, Victor clapped my shoulder and said, "Good thinking. This'll work out for everyone." It was the last illusion I needed to lose. When dawn broke the next morning, I already knew what was coming. I just didn't expect it to arrive so boldly, with a moving truck and forged papers and confidence built on assumptions that would finally collapse under the weight of reality. The sound woke me before I even opened my eyes. A low engine rumble cutting through the quiet mountain morning, followed by the unmistakable crunch of heavy tires on gravel. For a few seconds, I stayed perfectly still, listening. Then I knew. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I walked to the front window and looked out. A moving truck had pulled into the clearing, big and white, like it belonged there. Behind it came my parents' car, then Victor's truck. They stepped out together, confident, energized, smiling like today was a victory lap. Caleb jumped down last, waving a thick envelope in the air like a trophy. "We did it," he called out before he even reached the porch. "Everything's signed. Filed. It's official." They moved fast, faster than made sense, like momentum alone could make it real. My father started directing the movers immediately, pointing through the windows at furniture, naming rooms, giving instructions. My mother carried boxes she'd already labeled, acting as if redistribution was a foregone conclusion. Victor joked with the crew about mountain roads and tight turns, acting like the man in charge. Caleb hovered near the steps, pride all over his face, explaining loudly how he'd handled the paperwork part himself. I didn't stop them. I stood in the doorway and watched as the first pieces of furniture were wrapped and lifted. My grandparents' rocker. The old bookshelf. Quilts folded too tightly into plastic bins. The casual way they touched those things hurt more than the audacity of the act itself. They talked logistics. Storage units. Garage sales. What stayed? What went? They spoke over each other, excitement layered with urgency, like time itself was against them. Then the energy shifted. Someone noticed the stillness above us. On the wide porch stood Jonathan Rice, calm, composed, his suit crisp against the wood. Beside him was a severe county sheriff's deputy holding an official folder. They hadn't announced themselves. They hadn't needed to. Authority has a way of speaking without sound. Everything stopped. My father's smile collapsed first. "Who's this?" he asked, trying to recover, trying to sound in control. Jonathan stepped forward slowly. "I'm the attorney representing the trust that owns this property." Caleb tightened his grip on the envelope. "We have paperwork," he said quickly. "It's all legal." Jonathan took the documents without comment and flipped through them with practiced ease. His expression never changed. "These filings are invalid," he said calmly. "Forged signatures. Unauthorized notary stamps. No matching certification records." Victor's face drained of color. "That can't be right." "We followed instructions." The deputy spoke next, voice even and firm. "Attempted transfer of property without owner consent constitutes title fraud under Tennessee law. This is formal notice to cease activity immediately." My mother covered her mouth. My father rubbed his temple, words failing him. The movers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to keep working or step back. Caleb's confidence shattered in real time. "I only signed what they told me to," he said, voice cracking. "I thought it was fine." Jonathan handed out copies of the trust documentation. "This property is held in an irrevocable trust executed legally weeks ago. Elena is the sole trustee. Any further action risks criminal charges." Silence settled hard and heavy. The deputy instructed the crew to stop. No loading. No removal. Everything stayed. The truck engine shut off. One by one, the certainty that had carried them up the mountain drained away. Victor avoided eye contact. My parents stood frozen between disbelief and shame. Caleb sat down on a box, head in his hands, suddenly very young. They left without protest. No shouting. No dramatic exit. Just retreat. The moving truck backed down the drive. Cars followed. Dust settled slowly, like the mountain itself exhaling. Jonathan stayed long enough to document the incident and explain next steps. His presence felt grounding. Protective. When he finally left, the cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Something had broken that couldn't be repaired. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Jonathan filed suit for attempted title fraud and interference with inheritance rights. Discovery uncovered everything. Forged emails. Coordinated planning. Online searches for quick transfer loopholes. Even messages discussing how to pressure me if I hesitated. The truth came out not through drama, but through paperwork. The case didn't drag on. The judge ruled decisively. Damages were awarded. Legal fees covered. Punitive penalties added. The number stacked higher than any of them anticipated. Victor's financial situation collapsed entirely under the weight. Bankruptcy followed, but it didn't erase everything. Garnishments and liens dragged on for months. After the ruling, contact stopped completely. No calls. No apologies. No explanations. Social media accounts went private. Numbers blocked. Holidays passed without cards or messages. The silence was absolute. And strangely, it brought relief. Life at the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt like healing. I worked the garden my grandmother loved, turning soil she had tended for decades. I repaired the porch roof my grandfather once patched temporarily, doing it properly this time. Evenings were spent by the fire, books open, tea cooling beside me. The quiet wasn't lonely. It was spacious. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for disappointment. Standing on the porch one morning, mist lifting from the valley below, I understood something fully. Protecting what matters sometimes means letting go of people who don't value it the same way. Boundaries aren't cruelty. They're clarity. And that clarity had finally given me something I'd never had before. Peace. The weeks after the ruling moved differently than anything I had known before. Time didn't rush or drag. It simply unfolded. Without phone calls to dread or surprise visits to brace for, the days found their own rhythm. Morning light filtered through the pines, soft and deliberate, like it had nowhere else to be. I woke early most days, not because I had to, but because quiet made it easy. I started with small things. Sorting through my grandmother's old recipe cards, the edges worn thin from years of use. Her handwriting leaned slightly right, confident and neat. I cooked the meals she used to make when I was younger, letting pots simmer slowly, filling the cabin with familiar warmth. Food tasted different when it wasn't rushed. When no one was waiting to criticize or redirect. Afternoons became about maintenance, the kind that doesn't show immediately but matters over time. I cleared debris from the back trail, repaired a loose step on the porch, replaced cracked panes in a side window. Each task felt grounding. Tangible proof that I could take care of this place, not because I was forced to, but because I chose to. I thought about my family often during that time, but the thoughts were quieter now. Less sharp. I replayed moments from childhood with more honesty than nostalgia. The patterns were easier to see without the noise of ongoing conflict. I stopped asking why they acted the way they did. That question had never led anywhere useful. Acceptance, I learned, wasn't approval. It was letting go of the need for answers that would never come. Caleb crossed my mind the most. Not with anger, but with sadness. He had been handed confidence without accountability his entire life. Watching it collapse that morning had been painful in a way I hadn't expected. I wondered how he was coping. Whether anyone was helping him process it, or if he was being told, again, that someone else was responsible. Victor disappeared almost entirely. Rumors filtered through distant acquaintances about him relocating, taking contract work wherever he could find it. The urgency that once fueled him had burned out, leaving exhaustion behind. My parents downsized quietly. No announcements. No explanations. Just distance. There were moments when loneliness crept in unexpectedly. Standing in the grocery store alone. Driving past families unloading cars on weekends. Seeing laughter that looked effortless. But the feeling passed faster than it used to. Loneliness, I learned, was easier to manage than betrayal. I started inviting friends up occasionally. People who knew me as I was now, not as a role I'd been assigned. They respected the space. Asked before changing plans. Listened without interrupting. It was strange at first, realizing how little effort healthy relationships required. No walking on eggshells. No proving worth. One evening, sitting by the fire with a cup of tea, I opened a box I'd been avoiding. Inside were letters my grandparents had written over the years. Notes tucked into books. Cards saved without reason. One envelope was addressed to me, written shortly before my grandmother passed. I hadn't been ready to read it until then. She wrote about pride, not in achievements, but in character. About noticing how I listened more than I spoke. How I showed up without being asked. How she trusted my judgment because I questioned myself instead of assuming I was always right. She ended the letter with a simple line. "You don't owe anyone access to what you protect." I cried then. Not the sharp kind. The releasing kind. As months passed, the legal aftermath finished settling. Payments came in slowly, drawn out, impersonal. I used the funds to restore parts of the cabin that needed attention, not to upgrade, not to modernize, but to preserve. I kept it as close as possible to what my grandparents built. Wood instead of glass. Function over flash. Quiet over spectacle. The place began to feel less like an inheritance and more like a home fully claimed. One crisp morning, standing on the porch, coffee warming my hands, I watched the mist rise from the valley. Birds moved between branches. The world felt steady. I realized then that I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies. Not for reconciliation. Not for permission. Letting go hadn't made me harder. It had made me clearer. Family, I learned, isn't proven by blood or history. It's proven by consistency, respect, and restraint. By knowing when to step back instead of take. The people who mattered most in my life now were the ones who didn't demand anything from me. The cabin stood solid behind me, unchanged in all the ways that mattered. It had weathered storms long before I was born and would weather more after me. My role wasn't to exploit it. It was to care for it. And in doing so, I finally learned how to care for myself. The first winter I spent entirely alone at the cabin was quieter than any before it. Snow fell heavy and slow, blanketing the trees, softening every sound until the world felt held in suspension. I learned the rhythm of it, when to stoke the fire, how to listen for the subtle shifts in the wind that meant another storm was coming. Solitude stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like presence. My own. I stopped checking my phone out of habit. No more expecting messages that never came. No bracing for disappointment disguised as small talk. The silence had weight, but it was honest weight. It didn't lie to me or ask for more than it gave. Sometimes I thought about what reconciliation might look like. Not in fantasy terms, but realistically. I imagined an apology without conditions. Accountability without excuses. Curiosity instead of entitlement. And then I recognized the truth. Those things weren't coming, not because I didn't deserve them, but because they required growth my family had never shown any interest in doing. Accepting that freed me from waiting. Spring arrived gently. The garden came back to life, green pushing through soil that had rested all winter. I planted the same heirloom seeds my grandmother once saved, following her notes carefully. Watching them grow felt like continuity, not replacement. Nothing had been lost. It had simply changed hands in the way it was always meant to. Occasionally, someone would ask if I regretted it. the legal action, the distance, the consequences. The question always carried an expectation, like regret was the natural conclusion. I never answered immediately. Not because I didn't know, but because the answer deserved honesty. No. I didn't regret protecting what mattered. I didn't regret choosing clarity over comfort. I didn't regret stepping out of a role that required me to shrink so others could feel larger. What I regretted, if anything, was how long it took me to believe that I was allowed to say no. I built a life that fit me, not one designed around managing other people's expectations. Friends became chosen family. Traditions formed organically. Laughter returned without tension attached to it. The cabin stopped being a battleground and became what it had always been meant to be. A place of steadiness. Standing on the porch one last time before summer, looking out over land that was finally safe, I felt something settle fully inside me. This wasn't about winning. It was about alignment. About living in a way that didn't betray myself just to keep the peace. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Boundaries don't destroy families. They reveal them. And what survives that revelation is what was real to begin with. I didn't lose everything. I kept what was true.